You've waited your entire life for this moment. Your body quakes as you walk to the pitch, and your mouth has never felt quite so dry. But now, it's your time. You and your 10 compatriots are on the grass, staring across at 11 opposing players, 11 adversaries, 11 enemies that you simply must defeat today. The dictator's eyes are on you. He's watching from high up in his box and waiting to see whether the best of his great nation are truly worthy of its potential. You must win, not just for yourself, and perhaps not at all for yourself, but for your nation. Such has been the role of sport in authoritarianism. Around the world, sport is tightly interrelated with not just leisure and enjoyment, but culture, economy, national pride. It's no coincidence, and no secret, that many of the most repressive and fascistic regimes in the world have used sport to represent something more, an extension of the dictatorship's values, of national pride, of the autocracy itself. Sport and athletics are a way not just to speak your allegiance to the state, but to put your back into it. From Nazi Germany to Soviet Russia and so many places in between, sport has been absolutely central to a regime's hold on its people. And as any reasonably close examination of the International Olympic Committee, the ownership of numerous sports clubs and tournaments, or for that matter, the ongoing World Cup in Qatar will tell you, that trend's not going anywhere anytime soon. Now look, we're going to get into some absolutely mental examples today, but before we do, it's essential to understand why sports can be such a powerful mechanism of social control. As nice as it would be if, say, table tennis could simply be an endeavor in harmless ball paddling, it's an unfortunate reality that regimes are constantly drawn to athletic performance as an expression of something deeper about their regime. Perhaps the simplest way of understanding this phenomenon is in terms of power projection, especially during peacetime. On this level, it's easy enough to understand. Totalitarian state XYZ isn't actively at war with democratic neighbor ABC, but my fascist footballers routed your vastly inferior team 6-0, so of course we're better than you. But there's much more power in athletic competition than simply what a regime would achieve with a win over a geopolitical rival. And the power of sport has potential to serve domestic goals as well as international ones. Sport is older than the dictator's regime, always. It connects to deep cultural memory and traditions, and its connection with the public is far deeper than any propaganda could ever hope for. Some people connect to sport through their children's participation in youth or amateur athletics. Others play for national teams, and many, many more are just fans of those teams, or just of a sport itself. And when this force for good is twisted by a ruling party, the results are just as pervasive. If the dictatorship needs a few 100,000 able-bodied young men, great, get them all really into rugby or gymnastics. If the regime needs to make sure people aren't spending their time bad-mouthing the supreme leader, then make sure they're not necessarily volunteering, but getting voluntold to play some afternoon volleyball every day after work. And if the dictator wants to make children really care about their country's world-ruling future, then their teachers can tell them about that future when they're happiest and most optimistic out on the football pitch with their friends. And just like there are some commonalities between the aspects of sport that each dictatorship finds most useful, those same dictatorships take common steps to lock their society down. Athletic clubs, commissions, and community groups are disbanded or shut down. Sports are nationalized. The right sports are built into the curricula, and the wrong sports are frowned upon or just banned outright. And those curricula for the sports that the regime deems acceptable will make their way into schools, into factories and universities. That way, every citizen can serve their state and pay tribute to it through that same athletic performance. The party, the leadership, is no longer distilled to photographs of the dear leader on a classroom or factory wall. The party is work, the party is play, and the party is everywhere. When Adolf Hitler officially consolidated his grip on Germany in March 1933, every aspect of society became subject to Nazification, and sport was absolutely no different. Physical education had been central to German education since the end of World War I, and in the 1920s, gymnastic and athletic examinations have been a prerequisite to university study. With this sporting culture already in place, the Nazi Party took full advantage during their rise to power, closing down social, religious, political, community sports organizations and integrating most youth physical education into the Hitler Youth program. Hitler's ideas of National Socialist education was built around the development of a healthy body above all else. It was through this process Hitler believed that willpower, responsibility, and the development of a strong socialist character could be achieved. As such, Nazi Germany saw to it that physical education would surpass mathematics, science, and history as the most important part of a young German boy's schooling. Younger children were instructed to focus on swimming, early teenagers focused their time on football, and the last 2 years of school-based physical education were dedicated to boxing. A failing grade in these classes meant failure to progress through school. As World War II drew closer, pre-military exercises like marching, spycraft, countryside war games are added to the curriculum, while girls focused on gymnastics, field hockey, and athletics. These activities were carefully chosen too, not to make better competitive athletes, but to help girls bring babies to term when they got older. Both Nazi Germany and Italy in the same period, which we'll cover shortly, viewed life as a constant struggle between strength and weakness, dominated by the strong. Thus, a person that was strong, healthy, and capable as an individual came to exemplify the strength and domination of the Nazi state. This was true of professional athletes, absolutely, but even a common German citizen's powerful, well-muscled Aryan body was a sign of a powerful Aryan race. Nowhere was this clearer than the 1936 Olympics, without which any discussion of Nazi sport culture would just be woefully incomplete. The geopolitical factors at play in this event absolutely deserve a video of their own, so just let us know in the comments if you'd like to see that. But even just focusing on the sports themselves, it's striking how important they were to Hitler's broader power projection. Berlin had already been awarded the 1936 Summer Games before Hitler took power, and though there had been international curiosity on whether the Nazis would even host the Games at all, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels saw them as a valuable opportunity. The regime took full advantage. The Olympic torch relay, first introduced at these games, would run through 7 countries Berlin would later occupy, and the torch itself was constructed by the same companies that manufactured Nazi weapons. Jewish athletes banned from sports clubs and facilities nationwide. German event winners and spectators ensured that Nazi chants and salutes were widespread, and though exceptionally brave black athletes like Jesse Owens and John Woodruff rightly considered their gold medals a slap in Hitler's face, other nations, even the United States, pulled Jews from their teams to appease his will. The Games were a hit, and by the end of the event, even the New York Times was praising the effects they would have on Germany's international standing. Japan's flirtation with democracy came to a decisive end in 1931 when the Japanese Empire marched on Manchuria. As Japan mobilized, its military leaders relied on sport at the community level to build its soldiers. Physical education had been compulsory in Japan since the early Meiji period, mostly calisthenics and games integrated into primary education. Under a harsher regime, these exercises took on much more of a military order, meant to emphasize collectivist ideals and teach physical subordination to an athletic instructor. Military drilling in secondary schools had been introduced all the way back in the 1880s, and hand-to-hand combat, martial arts, had been used both for physical training and cultural education for some time. But in the 1930s, those martial arts were made compulsory in secondary and upper primary grades. Boys learned the sword-fighting skills of kendo and the grapples and throws of judo, and girls learned to use a bladed staff, the naginata, and the bow, kyudo. These sports were meant to mold the traditional ideal Bushido, or samurai spirit. As the war in China grew longer, army officers were put in schools to institute clearly military exercises, throwing grenades, drilling with bayonets, and running with gas masks or stretchers. Also in 1939, a new sport, if you could call it that, was added to the national curriculum, Kokubo Undo, or exercises of national defense. Extracurricular sports, especially Western ones, were run out of communities, replaced by encouragement from the empire to spend any spare physical energy on martial arts training. The regime's policies also mandated regular examinations and disease inspections on the bodies of every Japanese male under 26 and every female under 20. Students and young adults were constantly compared to the state's expectations for the physical bodies of a person of their size and age, and scores across Japan and within individual prefectures impacted government decision-making. Outside of schools, a range of sport options were integrated into companies, and gymnastics were even made mandatory for many Japanese workers. Even as war broke out and ground on toward defeat, many Japanese citizens would continue physical preparations for their final battle until the war's end in 1945. Rounding out the major Axis powers, we come to fascist Italy. Benito Mussolini was the definition of a strongman dictator, and in his autocracy, physical fitness started at the top. Much like Vladimir Putin using shirtless bear riding and his arsenal of judo throws to try and build the image of a strong, virile Russian leader, so too did Mussolini build a national and global reputation for his physical strength and prowess. He was drawn to events in which he could pitch hay with peasants, ensure that the state media caught him with his shirt off, and rarely did he miss an opportunity to swing a sledgehammer. Dangerous times made powerful men, or so the thinking went, and as the ranks of Mussolini's black shirts swelled, it was with the same sort of beefy young brawlers who could be relied upon to beat up leftists in street fights, while not thinking too deeply into the issues with fascist ideology. This, of course, was no coincidence. As Mussolini entrenched his hold on power, his party ensured that the future of Italy was filled with strong children and youth who could carry on in his image. In fact, physical educators in fascist Italy were imagined as biological engineers and the builders of the human machine. When paired with the regime's broader ideal of the young man as a bold, aggressive, even confrontational figure, it's easy to see what exactly these biological engineers were trying to create. Mussolini's prime examples of the new Italian received a warm reception at the 1932 Olympics, when Italy's all-male team was affectionately named Mussolini's Boys and followed around Los Angeles. And again in 1936 in Berlin, when a group of women athletes demonstrated the new breed of Latin athleticism. And at home in Italy, massive sporting facilities and arenas were constructed across the nation with the intent to foster a societal revolution in which fitness and fascism were inextricably linked. Now this brings us to fascist Italy's other major sporting focus, football, and specifically the 1934 World Cup. An absolutely massive global event, the 1934 Games took place in Italy and were a prime opportunity for Mussolini to market his own unique brand of fascism to the world. His regime poured a truly wild amount of money into making sure that the event went off without a hitch. Matches were held in 8 major cities, each bequeathed with breathtaking stadiums, which in turn would host record-breaking levels of international turnout. Italian propagandists churned out huge amounts of World Cup merchandise, all of which tightly merged football imagery with that of the fascist state. Football in Italy had taken off in the early 1930s with a fantastic winning record for the national team, plus significant victories by local teams and a cultural initiative to funnel young, bold Italians onto the pitch. So when the Italian team obliterated the United States in the qualifying round, beat Spain and Austria in the tournament, and won the final match against Czechoslovakia, it was seen as a truly massive moment for the regime. Mussolini himself had attended the tournament, as had the Italian royal family, and an average of over 20,000 fans per match. It was an expression of every form of Italian strength and pride that Mussolini's regime had promised its people, and with follow-up global football victories at the 1936 Olympics and the 1938 World Cup, football and Italy were fundamentally linked until the beginning of the Second World War. The use of sports in dictatorship takes a necessary, albeit brief, pause during World War II, as able-bodied citizens of every participating nation were sent to battle. But after the war's end, peacetime regimes shifted their attention back to the questions of population control and working-class physical capacity that had dominated their attention in the interwar years. In 1949, Mao Zedong completed his takeover of mainland China. Like the totalitarian leaders before him, Mao sought to leverage the full potential of his nation's people in service to the ruling party. And like those other leaders, Mao was quickly drawn to the idea of athletics. From the early days of his rule, Maoist policy dictated that sport and physical activity were central to building a strong, healthy, capable working class. Participation in these sorts of activities weren't only for the strongest and most elite, they were for everyone. And to put it lightly, they were not optional. Physical education was made mandatory for students, workers, soldiers, and party elites alike, heavily relying on a system of twice-daily calisthenic exercises meant to be accessible for every able-bodied citizen. And as expansive as Mao's visions were for the Chinese everyman, so too were they aspirational when it came to China's elite athletes. From the early 1950s, Mao believed that communist nations could prove their worth against democratic ones through victory in competition. In fact, this is how China would first reopen diplomatic relations with the United States, in a table tennis competition that is today known as ping-pong diplomacy. Due to a long list of factors within the Maoist regime, which could fill an entire video on its own, China's sporting infrastructure didn't see much international competition until Mao's own death in 1976. But from the early 1980s onward, Chinese athletes and sports teams have made a long series of impressive appearances on the international stage, a legacy that indeed continues to this day. Much of China's athletic approach was essentially modeled on the Soviets. Coming from harsh weather conditions in northern Europe and Asia, the Russian proletariat prior to 1917 were far more concerned with survival than athletic development. But this all changed once the Soviets took control. Similar to other nations we've already seen, Soviet domestic propaganda emphasized the role of individual physical fitness in the grand mission to build Russia's newest iteration. Displays of strength and gymnastic skill were highly prioritized in the early days of Soviet rule, with regular grand demonstrations for Stalin and his party leaders in the 1930s. Under the Communist Party, sport was developed widely at the grassroots level, with collectives, schools, and factories all fielding their own sports teams. The government also embarked on Russification campaigns for major sports, renaming moves in boxing and wrestling, for example, and developed combat sports like Sambo, a hybridization of grappling and striking martial arts. There were, of course, complications. Athletes were especially vulnerable to the regular purges that characterized the regime, and in one particularly wild example, a ski club was labeled a terrorist organization and its leader was executed. The Soviet Union, everybody. But even despite this danger, citizens under the Soviet Union largely continued to participate, with varying levels of choice in the matter. Despite their emphasis on sports at home, the Soviets boycotted or were not invited to every Olympic Games from 1920 to 1948. But in 1952, Eastern Bloc athletes tried their luck for the first time and finished second overall in total medals won. For the next 7 Olympic Games the Soviets took part in, they dominated the overall medal count in 5 of them. Internationally, gymnastics, weightlifting, figure skating, and wrestling were among Soviet Russia's best sports. But it wasn't uncommon to see Soviet athletes excel in a far greater proportion of fields overall. For the athletes, this was just part of the job. But in the eyes of the party, fun and competitive spirit were never the goal to begin with. The goal was Soviet superiority, and by all accounts, Soviet athletes were successful in making that happen. Now we move to a topic that our viewers knowledgeable on the subject have most likely been waiting for. Fascist Spain and its leader, Francisco Franco. Dictator since 1939, Franco's use of Nazi and Italian fascist troops during the Spanish Civil War had made his country into a pariah state. Moreover, his brutal repression of rebel factions during the war made Franco deeply unpopular in his home nation, especially in Catalonia. His solution, though, was an unorthodox one for his time and still stands as one of the only examples of its kind in history. He'd retain his rule by sport, and specifically by football. After an initial wave of changes reinforcing his regime's power over regional football teams in anti-Franco cities, the dictator chose Real Madrid as the team that would represent his own influence. Already a highly successful team at home and abroad, Real Madrid also offered Franco a platform to target Catalan and Basque cultural identity. With the help of some backdoor dealings, Real Madrid quickly came to dominate the Spanish football scene. Football had been the sport of the masses before Franco came to power, and the fascists fed its popularity with every tool at their disposal. In times of unrest or popular discontent, football would be broadcast across the country in a remarkably successful attempt to distract the public from more pressing political issues at home. If a particularly thorny issue came up in Spanish discourse, it was sure to be accompanied by a fixed and highly divisive source of controversy in a football match, one that would dominate national conversation for weeks or even months to come. Of course, Real Madrid was at the center of it all, a projection of Franco's personal power and his dominion over Spain. The team received some very helpful player additions as a direct or indirect courtesy of Franco's attention and his pocketbook, when Real Madrid would win a remarkable string of 5 straight European titles in the 1950s. Franco saw to it that athletes defecting from communist nations would receive asylum in Spain, gearing up for a football confrontation that would eventually pit fascism against communism, and when that day finally came in 1964 at the European Championship, Franco got his flagship victory over the Soviet footballers 2-1. The fascist regime's exploitation of Spanish football culture would persist until Franco's death in 1975, and although modern Spanish society, and especially Real Madrid, reject association with the Francoist regime out of hand, its impact on Spanish football culture's modern legacy can't be ignored. And finally, though we could highlight a number of other regimes throughout history, we would be remiss not to discuss Argentina's sporting culture under Juan Perón. Himself a fencing champion and a lifelong devotee of athletic culture, Perón was a highly enthusiastic spokesperson for the value of sport in everyday life, both for educational and self-developmental reasons. The dictatorship ensured that the teaching and practice of sport was closely tied to Argentinian culture and the doctrines and propaganda of the ruling elite. In Argentina, these changes were primarily targeted towards children and teenagers, with far less focus on working adults. With significant financial backing, sporting and social welfare organizations quickly spread Peronist influence across Argentina, and courtesy of then First Lady Eva Perón, Argentinian leadership went out of their way to ensure that women and girls were as heavily involved in these programs as the boys and men. And similarly to Franco's regime in Spain, Perón in Argentina relied on football to project power both domestically and internationally. By all accounts, Perón actually cared about the game in a way Franco never did, but this made it all the easier for the state to cultivate an image of Perón as a benevolent sportsman first and a potentially controversial politician second. Notably, Perón didn't see much benefit in proving Argentine football dominance globally. In fact, his team skipped several major tournaments to avoid the risk of losing. Instead, domestic club football ran Argentina's national discourse, a tradition that would continue even after the Peronists overthrew the subsequent military junta. Led by Jorge Videla, the junta came to power by force in 1976 and used football as a far more heavy-handed means of social control. Seen primarily as a distraction from the Argentine government's continued brutal repression of its own people, the intensity of football fandom in Argentina became almost proportional to the intensity of state violence happening at a given time. Videla ensured that Argentina would host the 1978 World Cup, a tournament Argentina's national team won amid widespread allegations of match fixing and corruption. Football became a means of almost literal proxy conflict, with Argentina's rivalry and subsequent arse-kicking of Peru on the football field being seen as a major factor in some later diplomatic decisions that were very favorable to Argentina. This pattern would continue until the military junta lost power in 1984, and its repercussions still follow to this day. By this point, although there are a long list of dictatorships and autocracies that could have made our list today, we trust that you get the point. But if you're now assuming that this pattern has been banished by the history books, you're probably not watching closely enough. Take, for example, the ongoing Russian doping scandal, in which massive proportions of Russian athletes in the 2014, 2016, and 2018 Summer and Winter Olympics and other worldwide games have been stripped of their competitive honors due to the use of banned substances. This practice has been thoroughly and rather blatantly state-sponsored and reached striking levels of operational sophistication. Russia has been banned from formal participation in the 2021 and 2022 Olympics and is restricted by the global governing bodies of many major sports. On the other side of the spectrum is China, whose regime has hosted a Summer Olympics in 2008 and a Winter Olympics in 2022. That's 2 games in the last 8, for those keeping track at home. In both games, China took full advantage of the opportunity to project a highly manicured image to the world and extend its geopolitical influence as a result. In 2008, worldwide viewers were treated to a snapshot into China's fast-growing economy, its architectural marvels, and its social scene. It was a careful depiction, but one that was intended to portray China as a nation Western audiences should welcome with open arms. In 2022, though, the image was notably different. China firmly and enthusiastically under the control of Xi Jinping, and one that was intent on proving itself on the world stage, whether Western viewers received the message favorably or not. The world of football has its modern examples of authoritarian influence too, with perhaps the most notable example being the United Arab Emirates' functional takeover of English football team Manchester United. Similarly, a Saudi-backed consortium just recently acquired the English club Newcastle United. Chelsea Football Club was owned by a Russian oligarch until just months ago, when said oligarch was forced out due to his close ties with Vladimir Putin and the invasion of Ukraine. Further, Qatar sports investments oversees France's most successful football club, Paris Saint-Germain. Finally, Turkey's dictator Erdogan has made football central to his own grip on power, which he is well on the way to consolidating into one-man rule. And from sport to sport, it goes on. The American NBA partnered with Rwanda's ruling dictator for the 2021 launch of the Basketball Africa League. Saudi dictator Mohammed bin Salman's golf series has generated equal parts international condemnation and enthusiastic participation by many prominent golfers eager to get in on the attached massive paycheck. And in the world of mixed martial arts, look no further than footage of Chechen warlord Ramzan Kadyrov's own sons beating up one of the most popular and dominant figures in the world, Khamzat Chimaev. Or actually, do look a bit further, because if you do, you'll see lots of photos of Kadyrov posing with Mike Tyson, Floyd Mayweather, and various combat sport legends. And returning once more to the Olympics, it's impossible to ignore the International Olympic Committee's role in welcoming autocrats and dictators to their platform. Finally, we got to talk about the World Cup. Ongoing as we speak, FIFA's 2022 World Cup tournament is held in Qatar, and quite frankly, we could fill an entire video with the human rights abuses the Qatari regime have committed in trying to make this event happen, and indeed we have. It's over on my channel, Into the Shadows, if you want to check it out. In that video, we talked about how Qatar allegedly bribed FIFA officials into selecting the country as the host of the event. We talked about the regime's long and ongoing history of repressing women and criminalizing homosexuality. We talked about the myriad mechanisms of wage slavery that Qatar has used to force its many migrant workers to build previously non-existent stadiums in record time. Qatar's policies have led to the deaths of thousands of migrant workers just since the 2022 Cup was granted to the nation. There are many ways Qatar stands to gain from the international attention, free advertising, and revenues inherent to hosting the biggest tournament for the world's biggest sport, and certainly Qatar and FIFA have worked together on what they hope will be a mutually enriching effort. The fact that said effort comes at the expense of many thousands of lives doesn't seem to matter to either FIFA or Qatar's leaders. Though there's certainly something to be said for preserving sport as an apolitical global forum, it is beyond naive to operate under the assumption that modern global sport can be apolitical even in theory. And it's even more ludicrous to claim that it is apolitical in practice. Sadly, the situation is unlikely to rectify itself anytime soon, but at the very least, global audiences can maintain an acute awareness of what exactly they're watching. And perhaps this is the most important lesson that you can take from all of this, that sport on the global stage is more than meets the eye. Though in an ideal world, athletic competition might provide a forum for peaceful, innocent, international rivalry, the reality is just far more complex. In many nations, the shadow hand of totalitarianism operates behind the sporting and athletic worlds, both at home and abroad. Frankly, there's no hopeful note to end on, no call to action that has any reasonable likelihood of being listened to. History repeats itself today, history will repeat itself tomorrow. And this particular part of history seems guaranteed to repeat itself for the foreseeable future. As for whether we should throw sport out entirely or write it off as a tool for dictators and despots, no. Definitely not. But we can keep a sharp eye, even as we watch from home, or sit in the stands with our popcorn and our beer. We can watch for the dictator, staring down from their private box. And when we spot one, we can resist the urge to forget what we have seen.